The officiant stopped mid-sentence. The guests stopped breathing. And Charles, the man I had loved for a year, the man I was supposed to marry in 4 minutes, made a sound I had never heard from him before. Something between a gasp and a surrender. Because Kang Sejun had just walked into our wedding. And he wasn't there to watch. "I'll marry her instead," he said. Just like that. Calm. Absolute. Like it was already done. I should have been terrified. I should have run. Instead, I looked at Charles, really looked at him, and I said, "How long?" He couldn't answer. So I picked up my bouquet, turned to the stranger at my altar, and I made the most dangerous decision of my life. I said yes. My queens, welcome back to another irresistible Mafia romance story. I missed you. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing where my girls are. And if you're new here, don't forget to like, share with your friends, and subscribe. Stay with me, because this story is about to get intense. Let me take you back to 4 days before that altar. Charles had chosen Seoul. A destination wedding. He called it romantic, cinematic, a city that felt like it existed outside of ordinary life. I believed him. I was good at believing Charles. He had a way of making everything feel intentional, like every decision he made was specifically designed to make you feel chosen. That was his gift. That was also, I would learn, his weapon. I had planned everything myself. The venue on the Han River, the flowers, the seating chart, the dress. Charles kept saying, "Just do what you want. You have better taste than me." I thought that was love. A man secure enough to hand the wheel over. I know now it was something else entirely. A man who knew the wedding was never going to happen doesn't argue about centerpieces. We landed in Seoul on a Tuesday. By Wednesday evening, I knew something was wrong. Not wrong the way arguments are wrong or distance is wrong. Wrong the way a room feels wrong before you notice the window is broken. Charles was performing. Laughing too quickly. Touching my hand too often in public and disappearing for hours in private. At dinner the first night, he looked over my shoulder 3 times in 10 minutes, not paranoid, not obvious, just enough that I noticed and said nothing and filed it. I was always filing things with Charles. I just never let myself open the file. The night before the wedding, he thought I was asleep. He went into the bathroom at 2 in the morning and turned on the shower. I lay in the dark and I listened. His voice came through the door in fragments, low, controlled, the voice he used when he needed someone to believe he had everything handled. I caught pieces. Not enough for a full sentence. Enough for a verdict. Collateral. Her name. Seoul. Done. I didn't move. I didn't knock on that door. I lay there while the shower ran and those words rearranged themselves in my mind until sunrise, and by the time the light came through the curtains I had made one decision. I was going to walk into that church. I was going to stand at that altar. And when the truth arrived, whatever shape it took, I was going to look it directly in the face. I just didn't know it was going to wear a dark suit and walk like it owned the floor beneath its feet. The ceremony had been running for 6 minutes when the doors opened. No dramatic entrance. They opened the way he did everything slowly, without apology, as though the concept of urgency was something that happened to other people. I heard the shift before I saw it. 40 guests moving in their seats. A ripple of held breath. The officiant's voice cutting off mid-word like a cord had been pulled. And Charles, beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat of his arm, went rigid. I turned. He was already looking at me. Not at Charles. Not at the room. At me. With a focus that had nothing performative in it, no theater, no cruelty on the surface. Just a man who had come here for something specific and was now recalibrating because what he found was not what he expected. He walked to the front of the room without hurrying. The silence held the entire way. He stopped beside me, not in front of me, not blocking me, beside me, like that position at the altar had always been his, and we were only now catching up to the fact. He didn't look at Charles. He looked at the room. "I'll marry her instead." 4 words. Calm. Absolute. And Charles made that sound, the gasp, the surrender, and his face went the color of something that had never seen sunlight. I understood it all in approximately 4 seconds. The late nights. The distracted eyes. The bathroom at 2 in the morning. Charles had made a deal, and I was the terms of it, and this man standing beside me at my altar had come to Seoul to collect what he was owed. The marriage wasn't desire. It was a consequence. A punishment so precise and so permanent that Charles would spend the rest of his life measuring the exact size of his mistake. The room was waiting for me to collapse. I looked at Charles one last time. Quietly. Without performance. "How long?" I said. He opened his mouth. Closed it. His hands were shaking. That was my answer. I picked up my bouquet. I turned to the stranger beside me, this man I did not know, this man whose name I had not yet heard, this man whose stillness should have made me run, and I looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. "Then let's not waste the venue," I said. And I walked toward him. Nobody stopped me. Not the guests. Not my maid of honor screaming from the 3rd row. Not Charles. That silence, 40 people watching and not one of them moving, told me more about who Kang Si-jun was than anything that came after. He offered me his arm. I took it. And we walked out of that venue together while my wedding dissolved behind us. I didn't look back. Not once. But I felt Charles watching. And I felt, for the first time in 4 days, like I could breathe. I learned his name in the car. Not from him. From the man in the front seat who handed a phone through the partition and said, quietly, "Mr. Kang. The documents are ready. Kong." I turned the name over in my mind while Seoul moved past the window, the city glossy and indifferent in the late afternoon light. All glass towers and river reflections and people who had no idea that a woman in a wedding dress was sitting in the back of a black car next to a man she had married 20 minutes ago without knowing his first name. I was still holding my bouquet. I set it on the seat between us and looked at him. He was looking straight ahead. Profile clean, jaw set, hands resting on his knees with the particular stillness of someone who had trained himself out of fidgeting the way other people train themselves out of drinking. Everything about him was controlled. Expensive. Deliberately unremarkable in a way that only very powerful people can manage. The kind of man who didn't need to announce himself because every room already knew. "Kong," I said. "Is that your first name or your last?" He turned and looked at me. The first time he'd looked directly at me since the altar. Up close his eyes were darker than I expected and more patient. The eyes of someone who was never surprised because he never stopped watching. "Last," he said. "Si-jun." "Sylvia," I said. Even though he already knew. Even though my name had been in whatever agreement Charles had signed without my knowledge. I said it anyway because I needed him to hear it from me, not from a document, not from Charles's mouth. From mine. Something shifted in his expression. Just slightly. Gone before I could name it. He looked back at the road. That was the entirety of our first conversation as a married couple. The penthouse was on the 54th floor of a building in Gangnam that didn't have a sign out front. The kind of address that doesn't need one. We rode the elevator in silence, and when the doors opened I walked into a space that stopped me mid-step, floor to ceiling glass, Seoul spread out below like a circuit board lit from within, the Han River a dark ribbon cutting through all that light. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was also completely impersonal. Expensive furniture arranged with precision. No photographs. No clutter. No evidence that a human being lived here rather than existed here. The kind of space that told you everything about a man who had built his entire life around control. Because you can control a space easier than you can control yourself. Si-jun moved through it like he always had. Showed me the residence in 3 sentences. The West Wing was mine. Accounts had been arranged. His assistant would send details in the morning. I could leave Seoul if I chose, but the marriage needed to remain intact until Charles's debt was fully resolved. He didn't know the exact timeline. He would let me know. He said all of this the way you brief a colleague. Efficient. Impersonal. Not cruel, just clean. Like he had decided in advance exactly how much space to give this situation and was holding the line with both hands. I watched him the entire time. "And if I have questions?" I said. "My assistant's number is on the phone in your room." "I meant questions for you." He paused. The first pause I had seen from him. Small, maybe 2 seconds, but on a man like Sejun 2 seconds was enormous. He looked at me with that patient, unreadable expression. "Get some rest," he said. "You've had a long day." And he left the room. I stood in the middle of that penthouse in my wedding dress, and I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I walked to the window and looked out at Seoul and let myself feel the one thing I had been refusing all day. Not fear. Not grief. Fury. Clean and clarifying and entirely my own. Charles had used my name as currency. Had flown me to a foreign city and stood me at an altar knowing what was coming. Had looked me in the eye for 4 days with guilt on his face and let me believe it was nerves. I was furious. And I was going to do something with it. I just needed to figure out what. By morning, Sejun was already gone. There was breakfast on the kitchen counter, prepared, covered, still warm, and a phone with a local number and a note from someone called Director Park listing everything the household could provide. Car service. Personal shopping. Medical. Security. Everything except the one thing I actually wanted, which was information. I ate breakfast slowly, and I thought about what I knew how to do. I was an international event logistics coordinator. My entire career was built on walking into complex, high-stakes environments where nothing was labeled and everything was connected, and mapping the system before anyone realized I was doing it. I knew how to read a room. I knew how to read people. And I knew that the fastest way to understand any operation was not to go to the top. It was to pay attention to everyone the top ignored. I started with the housekeeper. Her name was Mrs. O. She was 60, precise, and had the particular loyalty of someone who had been with the household long enough to become part of its architecture. She wasn't going to give me information directly. I wasn't naive enough to think that. But she would give me behavior. Patterns. The small involuntary things that people who work closely with power do without realizing they're doing them. I noticed she always had dinner ready by 9. Not 8. Not 10. 9, which meant Sejun was reliably home by 9 regardless of what his day held. I noticed she kept a specific brand of barley tea on the counter that she never offered guests, which meant it was his, which meant it was a preference, which meant somewhere underneath the architecture there was a person with preferences. I noticed she looked at the door at 8:45 every single evening with an expression that wasn't anxiety. It was something closer to relief. Like his arrival meant the day had resolved correctly. I filed all of it. Then something unexpected happened. On the third evening, Sejun came home at 8:30 instead of 9. He walked in, stopped when he saw me at the kitchen counter reviewing vendor contacts on my laptop, and for just a moment, just one unguarded moment, something moved across his face that he didn't have time to control. It wasn't annoyance. It wasn't inconvenience. It looked almost like relief. He covered it immediately. Asked if the accounts were satisfactory. I said yes. He nodded and walked toward his office, and I turned back to my laptop and said, without looking up, "Barley tea is on the counter." He stopped walking. 3 full seconds of silence. "Mrs. O told you," he said. "Mrs. O didn't tell me anything," I said. "I just pay attention." Another pause. Longer this time. Then the sound of a cabinet opening. The soft click of a mug on the counter. And instead of taking it to his office, he sat down at the kitchen island, 6 feet from where I was working, and drank it there. He didn't speak. I didn't speak. We sat in the same silence for 40 minutes, and it was the most honest thing that had happened between us since the altar. When he left the room, I looked up and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not warmth exactly. Not yet. Something more dangerous than warmth. The specific feeling of a puzzle beginning to show its shape. I was starting to understand him. And I had a feeling quiet and certain and lodged somewhere beneath my ribs that he knew it. Charles found me on a Thursday. Not directly, Charles was many things, but he wasn't stupid enough to show up at Sejun's building unannounced. He routed it through my maid of honor, Bria, who sent a message to an old email address she knew I still checked. 3 lines. "He's still in Seoul. He's sorry. He needs you to know that." I read it twice. Then I closed the laptop and sat with it for a moment, Not because I was tempted, but because I wanted to be honest with myself about what I felt. And what I felt was nothing that resembled the thing Charles was hoping for. No pull. No softening. Just the quiet, almost clinical recognition that a man who had bargained with my name was now using the word sorry like it was a currency he still had. He didn't. That evening at dinner, I told Sejun. We had been eating together most evenings by then, not by arrangement, not by anything either of us had said out loud. It had simply evolved the way things evolve between two people living in the same space who are both too aware of each other to pretend otherwise. He sat across the table. I sat across from him. Mrs. O served and disappeared, and the city glittered below us, and we talked about nothing consequential, and somehow that nothing felt like the most consequential part of my day. I told him about Bria's message between the main course and whatever came after it. Casually. Like it was information rather than a test. It was absolutely a test. He went very still. Not his usual stillness. That was a chosen thing, controlled and architectural. This was different. This was the stillness of something being held back. He set his chopsticks down with a precision that was almost too careful and looked at me. Did you respond? No, I said. He looked at me for a moment longer than necessary. Then he picked up his chopsticks and returned to his food. But he didn't eat. He was thinking. I could see it in the slight tension at the corner of his jaw, the way his eyes had gone somewhere internal. And I felt it again, that thing beneath my ribs. The puzzle showing more of its shape. You're not going to tell me to stay away from him, I said. Not a question. You already decided that, he said. Before you told me. I looked at him across the table and felt something shift, quietly, irrevocably, the way tides shift. He was right. I had decided. I told him not because I needed permission or protection. I told him because I wanted him to know. Because somewhere in the last 10 days this man had moved from a stranger I had walked toward out of fury into something I didn't have a clean word for yet. I wasn't ready to examine that. So I picked up my glass and changed the subject, and he let me, and the fact that he let me undid something small and structural inside my chest. 3 days later, he took me to dinner outside the penthouse for the first time. A restaurant in Itaewon, quiet, private, the kind of place that didn't appear on any app and required a specific name at the door. We sat by the window with Seoul spread out below us, and for the first time since the church we were somewhere that wasn't his territory, wasn't managed by his staff, wasn't wrapped in the architecture of his control. We were just two people at a table. It felt enormous. We talked differently that night. Slower. He asked me about my work. Genuinely asked, not politely, the way you ask when you actually want the mechanics of the answer. I told him about event logistics, about the specific pleasure of making complex systems run invisibly, about the time I managed a crisis at a state dinner in Lagos that nobody ever knew happened because I contained it in 11 minutes. He listened with his full attention, and I was learning that Sejun's full attention was a specific and overwhelming thing, like standing in direct sunlight after a long time indoors. I was midway through a sentence when I saw his expression change. Not much. Just enough. I turned. Charles was standing at the entrance of the restaurant. He looked terrible, unslept, unraveling at the edges, the charm worn down to something rawer and more honest underneath. His eyes found me immediately, and in them I saw the thing I had been waiting to feel and didn't. Guilt, yes, but also love, and that was the complicated part. Charles had loved me. He had also destroyed me. Both things were true, and neither one canceled the other out, and I had exactly 2 seconds to decide how I felt about him standing 20 feet away before everything accelerated. He started walking toward us. And Sejun reached across the table and took my hand. Not slowly. Not performed. It happened the way involuntary things happen, before the decision catches up to the action. His hand covered mine on the table, warm and certain and completely still, and I felt the shock of it move through me from my fingertips to somewhere considerably more interior. I did not pull away. I couldn't have told you in that moment whether I stayed because of Charles watching or because of the warmth of Sejun's hand or because every nerve in my body had just simultaneously decided that this was exactly where my hand was supposed to be. All three, maybe. None of them, maybe. I only knew that I turned back to Sejun and looked at him, and he was already looking at me, not at Charles, not at the room, at me, with something in his eyes that he hadn't managed to control in time. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't performance. It was wanting. Quiet and contained and clearly not new, like something he had been managing for longer than I knew and had just, for one unguarded moment, stopped managing. Charles stopped walking. Said my name. Said he just needed 5 minutes. Said he could explain everything if I would just give him 5 minutes. I looked at Charles across the restaurant, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not sadness. Pity. Clean and final and completely without cruelty. He had loved me the best way he knew how, which had turned out to be nowhere near enough, and there was nothing left between us now except the echo of what he had done with my name. You should go, Charles, I said. He looked at Sejun's hand over mine. Something broke open in his face. He left. The restaurant settled back into its ambient noise around us, glass and low conversation, and the city outside carrying on with magnificent indifference. Sejun's hand was still on mine. Neither of us had moved. Neither of us spoke for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, quietly, "You didn't need me to do that." "No," I said. "I did it anyway." "I know," I said. "I noticed." He looked at me. And for the first time since the church, since that very first moment when he had stood beside me at the altar and I had caught something unguarded in his face before he could contain it, for the first time, he almost smiled. Almost. His thumb moved once across my knuckles. Slow. Deliberate. Like a question. I turned my hand over beneath his. Like an answer. Now if you've been watching this long, you already know this story isn't going where Charles thought it was going. And it's not going where Sejun planned either. But before we get to what happens next, if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what's coming in the next part of this story is the moment everything between them breaks completely open, and you do not want to miss it. We didn't talk about it on the way home. We sat in the back of the car in the particular silence of two people who have just crossed a line and are both privately deciding what to do about it. Sol moved past the windows. His hand was no longer on mine, but I could still feel the weight of it, not uncomfortably, not with longing exactly. With the specific awareness of someone who had been touched carefully for the first time in a long time and was still adjusting to what that felt like. I looked out the window and thought about what I knew. Sejun had not done anything impulsive in his adult life. I was certain of that the way I was certain of things I had observed rather than been told. Every move he made was calculated, weighted, arrived at through a process I was only beginning to understand. The hand across the table was not calculated. It had happened before he decided it, and the moment I turned my hand over beneath his, I watched him feel the full weight of that, watched something move through his eyes that he spent the rest of the dinner quietly containing. He was afraid. Not of me. Of what I was doing to his architecture. I understood that more than I wanted to admit. Because he was doing the same thing to mine. We got home at 11. He walked me to the door of the West Wing. He had never done that before, and stopped outside it. We stood in the corridor with the city dark and glittering through the glass behind him, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and the air between us was doing something I didn't have language for yet. "Good night, Sylvia," he said. My name in his mouth. The first time he had used it since I had told him in the car. Something about the way he said it, careful, like he was handling something he didn't want to damage. "Good night, Sejun," I said. I went inside. Closed the door. Stood with my back against it in the dark and pressed my hand flat against my sternum like I could slow whatever was happening in there through sheer pressure. I couldn't. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing as I stood against that door, was that Charles had not gone back to his hotel after the restaurant. He had gone somewhere considerably more dangerous. And by morning, everything was going to change. I woke at 6 to the sound of voices. Not loud, Sejun's world didn't operate in loud. Everything in his orbit was calibrated, contained, delivered at a frequency designed not to carry. But I had spent enough mornings in this penthouse to know it sounds intimately, Mrs. O's soft movements in the kitchen, the particular hum of the elevator, the way the wind pressed against the glass on the east side at dawn. These voices didn't belong to any of that. They were tense in the specific way of men delivering information that nobody wants to receive. I didn't go to the door. I sat up in the dark and I listened. I caught fragments the way I had caught fragments through a bathroom door 3 weeks ago in a hotel that felt like another lifetime. Different words this time. Rival faction. Information breach. Someone talked. And then one phrase that landed in my chest like something physical. He told them she got inside. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I got up, put on a robe, and walked out. The voices stopped the second I appeared. 3 men I hadn't seen before stood in the main room with Sejun, all of them turning toward me with expressions that ranged from careful to hostile. Sejun looked at me across the room with something I couldn't immediately read. Not anger. Not the controlled blankness he defaulted to when he was managing something. Something tighter than that. More interior. Go back to bed, he said. Quiet. Absolute. Tell me what Charles did, I said. Equally quiet. Equally absolute. The room held its breath. One of the 3 men shifted his weight. Sejun looked at me for a long moment, the patient, unreadable look, except this time I was patient enough and fluent enough in him to see underneath it. He was making a calculation. Not about security or protocol, or any of the operational things the men in the room were waiting for him to prioritize. He was deciding how much I could handle. That was the thing that moved me past careful and into something fiercer. Don't do that, I said. Don't decide for me. Something shifted in his face. He looked at the 3 men and said one word in Korean, and they left the room with a speed that told me everything about the kind of authority he carried without ever raising his voice. Then he looked at me. Charles had gone to a rival faction, one of 2 organizations in Seoul that had been waiting years for a fracture in Sejun's operation. He had offered them information. Access points. Structural details about how the Kang family moved money and people through the city's nightlife network. Details he had accumulated over years of laundering through it. Details that in the wrong hands could dismantle things it had taken Sejun a decade to build. In exchange, Charles wanted one thing. His debt cleared. And me returned. Sejun told me all of this standing in the middle of his living room at 6 in the morning with soul pale and barely awake outside the glass behind him. He told me without softening it, without managing the delivery, without any of the careful distance he had maintained for 3 weeks. He just told me. And I stood across from him, and I took it in, and I did not look away. When he finished, I said, "What does this mean for you?" He looked at me like the question surprised him. Like he had been braced for something else, fear or accusation, or the specific panic of a woman realizing the consequences of the situation she had walked into. He had not been braced for me asking about him. "It's manageable," he said. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. Longer. He turned toward the window, and I watched his profile against the pale morning light, the jaw, the stillness, the weight of something he was deciding whether to put down. "It complicates things," he said finally. "They'll move on the information within 48 hours. I have to move first. And after it's handled." Sejun. He turned at his name. I had never used it like that before, not as a label, not as an address. As a demand for his actual attention. He turned and I was looking directly at him, and for once neither of us was performing anything. "Are you safe?" I said. The question landed in the room and stayed there. He looked at me for so long that I started to feel the specific vulnerability of having asked it, of having shown him that his safety was something I was tracking. Something that mattered enough to ask about at 6 in the morning in a robe in the middle of whatever crisis Charles had just ignited. I had shown him my hand and I knew it and I didn't take it back. "Yes," he said. Soft. Like the word cost him something. He left an hour later. I watched him go from the window, the black car pulling out below, soul swallowing him up, and I sat with the feeling that had taken up permanent residence beneath my ribs and finally, honestly, named it. I was in love with him. Not the slow accumulating kind. The kind that had apparently been building since a church in Itaewon and a bouquet I had picked up off an altar and a man who had gone still when I walked toward him like nobody had ever done that before. Like the possibility of being chosen was something he had quietly stopped believing in a long time ago. I sat with it all day. The penthouse was silent. Mrs. O moved carefully around me and didn't ask questions, and I was grateful for it. I worked. I made calls. I did all the things a person does when they are trying to keep the surface of themselves functional while something enormous rearranges everything underneath. He came back at midnight. I was awake. I had not pretended to be otherwise. I was sitting in the main room with a book I hadn't read a single word of when the elevator opened, and he walked in and stopped when he saw me. He looked exhausted. Not physically, Sejun would never allow himself to look physically diminished. It was too embedded in how he moved through the world. But there was something behind his eyes that the hour and whatever the day had required of him had worn thin. Something that his control was still covering, but only just. Only barely. I set the book down. He sat on the opposite end of the sofa, closer than his usual careful distance. Not close enough to touch. Close enough that I was aware of every inch between us in a way that was almost unbearable. "It's handled," he said. "I know," I said. I waited anyway. He looked at me, and something in his face did what it had been trying not to do for 3 weeks. It came undone. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough. Just the particular undoing of a man who has held everything together for so long that one person simply staying awake for him is enough to break something open. "I saw you," he said. "Before the wedding." I went still. 3 months ago. A venue walkthrough for one of Charles's events. You were managing something, I don't know what. I couldn't see the problem from where I was standing. But I could see you, and I watched you handle it, and I left without speaking to you because he stopped. Started again. Because I didn't know what I would say. The room was very quiet. When Charles offered you as collateral, he said, my first instinct wasn't to collect the debt. It was rage. That he had made you a transaction. That he had taken something another stop. His jaw tightened. I came to that church because I wasn't going to leave you in something you didn't know you were in. I looked at him across the sofa, and I felt the full weight of it. Every day in this penthouse, every careful distance, every controlled exchange, all of it reframing at once. He had not come to the church for the debt. He had come for me. And he had spent 3 weeks managing that like a crisis, containing it, holding the line, because a man like Sejun did not know how to want something without turning it into a problem to be solved. "I heard you," I said. "In the church." When you said it, he waited. "Your voice changed," I said. "When you said you'd marry me, it wasn't the same voice you walked in with." Something in it broke open, just for a second. I saw it, and I walked toward it. Not away from Charles. Toward that. The silence between us now was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of two people holding back. The silence of two people who have just put everything down and are standing in the space that creates. He moved first. Not fast. Sejun never did anything fast. He reached across the distance between us on that sofa, and his hand came to the side of my face, careful, like I was something he had been afraid to touch in case it changed the nature of what it was. And I leaned into it before I could think about it and felt him exhale like he had been holding his breath for 3 weeks. I reached up and adjusted the collar of his jacket. Just that. The smallest, most domestic gesture in the world, my hands on him, deliberate, unhurried, like I had been doing it for years and intended to do it for many more. He went completely still beneath it. The man who controlled everything. Letting one person close without calculation. Without management. Without the architecture. He covered my hand with his and held it there against his chest, and I felt his heartbeat, faster than his stillness suggested, faster than he would ever have allowed me to know if he had any choice in it. He didn't have a choice anymore. Neither did I. "Sylvia," he said. Just my name. The way he had said it outside my door, careful, like something worth protecting. Except this time it wasn't good night. This time it was something that didn't have a word yet. Something that was only ours. "I know," I said. And I did. Charles was gone. The debt was settled. The rival faction had been handled with the quiet efficiency of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to make his point. All of it resolved, all of it behind us, the church and the altar and the bouquet and the car ride and the silence of 3 weeks of two people who couldn't afford to want each other learning that they did anyway. Outside, Soul glittered 54 floors below us. Indifferent and magnificent and completely unaware that somewhere above it, in a penthouse that had never quite felt like a home until now, a woman who had walked into a stranger's wedding and out of her own life was exactly where she had chosen to be. Not because she had no options. Not because she was afraid. Because she had walked toward the truth in a church 3 weeks ago, and the truth had turned out to be this: a man with steady hands and an unsteady heart who had seen her once across a crowded room and had never quite recovered. And honestly, neither had she. My queens, if this story wrecked you the way I think it did, you know what to do. Like this video, share it with every girlfriend who deserves a Sejun in her life, and subscribe so you never miss a story. I pour everything into these, and knowing you're here makes every single one worth it. Drop a comment and tell me, are you Team Sylvia or did Sejun completely steal the show? I'll be reading every single one. Until next time, my loves, stay dangerous, stay chosen, and I will see you in the next story.